He left home and never looked back. Chapter 2, he called the Paul Leslie Hour. And that's where we are today. I'm Don Giller, and now your host, Paul Leslie.
Hey, it's me. Jason Zinoman is joining us. He's a writer of the column On Comedy for the New York Times. He's contributed to other prestigious publications such as Vanity Fair, The Guardian, and Slate. He's authored a few books. Recently, his New York Times bestseller, Letterman, The Last Giant of Late Night, was published as a softcover. Jason Zinoman, how are you, sir?
I'm great, and it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm really honored that you would join us. I really, really enjoyed the book very much, so much so that I read it twice.
Oh, my God. You're the best. You're the perfect kind of reader.
I was going to write a top 10 list on why you should do an interview with me if you had declined my request.
I should have made you work harder. I shouldn't have been such a cheap date and just said yes right off the bat. It sounds like you're a big Letterman fan. No?
You would be correct. Yes.
Okay. Dating how far back?
Oh gosh, I would say going back from the time I was like 10, 11 years old.
Wow. Okay. So that's and do you have a favorite era or period or?
I would say late 80s, early 90s would be my spot.
Yep. I think we're on the same page. Partially because there's sort of when I wrote the book, I sort of went back and watched all the the shows, so to try to look at them with a clearer eye. But of course, the way you really watch them is with somebody who's on TV for 3 decades, you change so much over the course of watching this show and this person, and the things that you watch as a 10-year-old or as a 15-year-old, which is how old I was when it was in 1990 or whatever, or as like a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, my math is right, when he leaves NBC to go to CBS, is formative in a way that the show that you watch as 30-something is not. So I have very fond and intense feelings about his late 80s, early 90s, which says more about me than it does about him.
Well, on the note of watching episodes, something that I noticed in the acknowledgments was that you said that the original plan, you wanted to watch all 6,024 episodes.
Yes. One of the many stupid ideas I began with this book with. It seemed, on the face of it, I was like, well, I'm going to write a book about some guy who did a show. You got to see the show, right, to do the book. I obviously have to see everything. But that's a lot of shows. And it proved very difficult, or much more difficult than I anticipated, to just track them down. And I ended up watching a huge number of those shows. I probably got into the thousands, 3,000, say.
Wow.
But all 6,000 I did not get to.
You were asking me, so now I would ask you, how did you come to experience this phenomenon we know as David Letterman? Your first exposure. My
first exposure was I wish I remembered the actual first show of his I saw, but I remember in the, early mid 80s, staying up past my bedtime and, turning the TV on, because I was like a real, I was addicted to TV as a kid. My parents used to call me Mike TV, the character from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who couldn't stop watching TV. So I'd watch everything on TV, Three's Company, whatever, game shows, everything. But back in those days, if you stayed up late and you snuck over to turn the TV on, there weren't a lot of options. And that stuck out to me as so bizarre and unusual and cool and it felt like it felt like there was an inside joke there that I didn't entirely get. I'm thinking now of reoccurring jokes like the giant doorknob, which just or how Letterman would say a phrase and he would just repeat it over and over again and until it just didn't make any sense what he was doing. And I remember watching it and thinking, there's something cool going on here. I don't totally understand it. And if I keep watching it, maybe I can kind of decode what is going on, which I actually weirdly think of it associated with Bob Dylan lyrics, because at the same time I started listening, my brother was really into Bob Dylan, and I was listening to Bob Dylan, and I bought a book of his lyrics. And, Dylan is sort of famously cryptic. And, so I would just sit down and listen to Ballad of a Thin Man and study the lyrics and try to probe them, read it over and over and over again and try to decode what he's saying and read other biographies of Dylan and try to figure. And I think in a lot of ways it was the birth of me being a critic, because, criticism is a lot just studying and trying to, part of it is trying to unpack complicated artistic texts. So Letterman, unlike so many things on TV that seemed all surface, seemed like there was a lot hidden and a lot of secret meanings, and I wanted to know more.
So you liked that it was kind of a world unto itself.
Yes. Well, that is precisely. That seemed exciting to me, that this was not just a guy telling jokes, that this was a guy, just as you put it, who created a world and a sensibility that wasn't necessarily easily accessible. And it's funny, these days, there's a lot of talk in popular culture today about world creating. There's the Marvel universe, or there's the world of a TV show like Mad Men that's very complex. I think it sort of goes without saying that there's a pleasure now in unpacking the mysteries of some world. But back then as a kid, it wasn't like I was reading recaps and, obsessing over reading tweets and being kid. There wasn't any of that stuff. I was a kid who grew up in, suburban Maryland and then Washington, D.C., who didn't have wasn't reading criticism outside of maybe Tom Shales in the Washington Post. And so it was just me seeing this strange Indiana broadcaster and trying to figure out what was so funny about it.
We're joined by Jason Zinoman, and he's the author of Letterman, the Last Giant of Late Night. What would you say that it was that inspired you to write this book?
Well, I would think two things. There's sort of the personal and the professional. The personal is sort of what we've been talking about, which is that I wanted to, because it was so formative for me, Late Night with David Letterman, I wanted to understand this better, to understand my own sensibility better. It sounds selfish, but it's true. But the bigger thing is that, a couple years ago or several years ago, I became the comedy critic of the New York Times, and in that capacity, I realized in talking to a lot of comedians that, here was a guy who had this huge impact on popular culture and yet also remained a bit of a mystery to a lot of people. So I thought, well, if part of my job is to try to understand and report about comedy today, that here's a guy who in a lot of ways is kind of a touchstone or Rosetta Stone to understand it. So I thought somebody's going to write a big biography of him, and why not me?
Amongst the people who are serial Letterman viewers of any era, would you say that you notice any kind of commonality, anything that they have that's in common?
For viewers,
the fans, yeah.
The fans. That's an interesting question. I hesitate to make overly sweeping generalizations in that he had a massive fan base. I mean, this is he was on network television at a time when the numbers were much larger than they were today. So, but that said, they skewed young, they skewed male, they probably skewed white is my guess. And I think, certainly at the time, the idea was that, he tapped into this college market demographic. But that of course changed as over the course of 30 years. I think his audience changed. But I wouldn't want to overstate. I mean, he definitely, women watched him too. It wasn't like there was just one gender. But I think if you were to say, what's the stereotypical Letterman fan, that would be it. I think also, people with an interest in unusual what became known as alt comedy. Letterman came up, among other ways, through comedy clubs, through the Comedy Store in LA. But I think if you were to track his sort of artistic influence, he gave a platform to a lot of comedians who were unusual, Pee Wee Herman or Andy Kaufman, or people who weren't comedians like, Howard Stern, people who were later on would become, I think, much more dominant in terms of the kind of artistic landscape. It wasn't just your standard setup joke comic. So I think people with an interest in innovation and unusual comedy were also more drawn to Letterman than, say, to Tonight Show.
We had one time on this show the comedian Tom Dreesen, and it was right around the time where Letterman was wrapping up his television days. And he said, if you like Letterman, get a good look now, because you'll never see him again. And now he has this show on Netflix, My Next Guest. And I'm very curious to know what you think about that.
I mean, it's a pleasure to see him back on television, first of all, or to see him back in. And I think some of the episodes have been, I think this last one with Tina Fey was quite good. And in theory, I think it's a great idea that by the end of his career, his strength was probably, long form conversation and, spontaneous talk. And that's where the show is. It's not about doing a monologue or doing comedy bits. It's about long form conversation and, intelligent long form conversation. So, I think it's a good idea, and there's things but I do have a few disappointments with it. I think it's shot in a strange way. It's kind of a little bit of the camera moves around too much for my taste, and I think some of the episodes seem a little like the match of host and guest seem a little awkward. And I think I think he's at his best when he's with somebody who's incredibly comfortable with and who's willing to kind of play with him and be even a little bit confrontational. And that hasn't been the case. This is generally speaking, it's like he's been with people where he's playing more of a kind of a journalistic role. And so anyway, the point, I guess to sum up, I like it, but it's not everything I was hoping.
Yeah. I think you're tapping into something really interesting here. And you go into this in the book, and I thought it was one of the really compelling parts of the book, and that's that Letterman was kind of a pioneer in getting to know people who were not celebrities. I mean, I think some of the most interesting bits was when he would go visit somebody like Rupert G, or just a person who was not trying to be famous. And that kind of became something that really changed our pop culture and our media. When you look at all the reality shows, he did that, turning the camera on everyday people. So
yes,
I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that quality that he had.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That's a thing that I am fascinated with, and I think is an underrated legacy of his, and that people forget that it was incredibly unusual to go on the street and turn interactions with ordinary people into comedy bits. That, The Daily Show made its bones on that, and now Conan does, and all sorts of places do. But Letterman really was doing something new there, and also just bringing the faces of non-celebrities. You know, he thought they were as funny as actors and non-actors. And then on a broad, you know, you point out this reality television. That I think is, you know, that's a point I made in the book that you know, didn't occur to me when I started the book. But when I started to look at the history of reality television and its relationship to late night, it became clear, which is that, you know, there really wasn't a whole lot of reality television in the 80s, but there was a little boomlet in the early 80s. There was a show called Real People, and you know, and before that, there was a PBS show called The American Family, and then there were sort of, this isn't reality, but Albert Brooks's book Real Life was sort of playing on these themes of ordinary people becoming famous. And late night was in this kind of early, I think if you read a history of reality television, was in this kind of boomlet in the early 80s. Then you fast forward to the real turning point, which is the premiere of The Real World on MTV, which is, I think, 92 or 93. That's when reality television really exploded and started to replace scripted dramas as, you know, a major kind of part of the cultural diet. And what's interesting is that that's precisely the moment that, you know, Letterman is moving from NBC to CBS and is at the height of his success. And, you know, what I argue in the book is that, you know, this stage of you know, Letterman in the early 90s and late 80s is one where part of the fun of the show is not in the jokes and not in the punchlines, but in him as a character, sort of him telling stories about being stopped for speeding, or him complaining about his bosses at GE, or, you know, his rivalry with Jay Leno and trying to get the Tonight Show, that he became sort of a hero of his own reality show, or him talking to the woman across the way, sort of flirting with her, this kind of romantic interest, that he became the center of this reality show about him. And I think a lot of the pleasure of watching late night in that period was similar to the pleasure people had of watching The Real World or the many, 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 many reality shows that followed. So he, you know, the argument I make is that he sort of anticipated the boom of reality television.
I wanted to get kind of a few of your favorites, if you will. What would you say would be the one bit that just never fails to make you laugh?
I think that would have to be Just Bulbs, which I don't know if you know that one, but there's a remote piece he did in, I believe is it 85, maybe around there, maybe earlier, where there's a store in New York, I believe it still exists, called Just Bulbs, and it just sells light bulbs. And he went in there and he, you know, basically plays dumb and says, like, you know, can I get a lampshade? And I said, no, we just sell bulbs. And he goes, can I get a sandwich? No, we just sell bulbs. And he was like, well, what about, you know, I forgot, maybe eventually was shades. And then the woman said, well, to get that, you have to go to Just Shades. And they cut to a store called Just Shades. And he has the same thing over and over. And it's just like a perfectly structured comedy bit with the beginning, middle, and end, but with real people acting. You know, they're such like classic New York characters, these people, and they're clearly they're not scripted. And he plays the kind of dope in it. And, you know, I've watched it countless times. I've shown it to my kids. They crack up. It hasn't aged a day. So that really is that would probably be it.
There were certain celebrities who would appear regularly on The Late Show. You know, you always would see certain people like Bill Murray, or Tom Hanks was a frequent guest. What would you say was your favorite regular guest?
Maybe Howard Stern, I think, or Terry Garr, one of those two. I mean, I always liked people that were disruptive.
Yeah.
Charles Grodin, you know, was another one. I mean, Andy Kaufman, obviously, but people who made him uncomfortable, put him ill at ease, but he still respected and liked, so he was game to play. Those people were, I thought, really interesting to watch. You know, there's also a genre of people he didn't like, which were also interesting to watch, but obviously wouldn't have him on that often. But the people like Stern, someone like Stern, who, he clearly really respects, and they do a similar thing. They're both broadcasters, but they're also at the same time wildly different. Letterman is this button-up, repressed Midwestern Gentile, and Howard Stern is this, shock jock, outrageous Jewish broadcaster who talks about sex and all these taboo subjects that Letterman wouldn't want to touch. So that kind of oil and water quality made them interesting, and as a matter of fact, that's the last episode of his Netflix show, is him and Howard Stern. So I'll be really interested to see what that's like.
I think he said something to the effect that the Stern one is the best one.
Is that right?
I think so.
Oh, that's exciting.
So look forward.
That's exciting, and I'm not surprised. I mean, Stern always brought his A game, and he was a big character in the. I always saw it as Stern sort of expressed his id, Letterman's id, like the things that Letterman didn't want to really say out loud, Stern would, and that's particularly true if you look back at his episode. And you can find them all on YouTube. His episodes about the Leno, where Stern was merciless about Leno in a way that Letterman never would, but he really deeply agreed with.
Something that has been written about lately that I'm hoping you can maybe share a couple of your favorite memories regarding would be the Letterman connection to music. It's been talked about that he's such a fan of music, and I have pretty vivid memories of seeing certain musical performances on there, and I'm hoping you can maybe share a couple that have been memorable for you.
That's an interesting question. There's an episode, if I'm remembering this right, with Sly and the Family Stone that's really amazing. That is, I think with Sly and the Family Stone, and George Meyer might have been the guest of one. I may have getting that wrong, but that was an amazing performance. I mean, Dylan was an amazing performance. I just recently was watching when he had the Beastie Boys on his new show doing Sabotage, right? Like the week he came out. That was fantastic. I mean, obviously Elvis Costello was always wonderful on the show. The Sonny and Cher duet was really memorable. It's interesting. He had 33 years of popular culture, so he had so many great musicians. I mean, he did like certain kinds of, I think, hard rock that he would bring back. But yeah, those were a few. What about you? What were your favorite musical performances?
I will say this. I would echo you in that the night we called it a day from Bob Dylan at the very end.
Yep.
The night before that on the radio, I played that song by Bob Dylan.
Really?
It was kind of eerie.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is eerie. Just a coincidence. I mean, it's not like Dylan's got a huge repertoire, obviously, so that is an amazing coincidence.
Yeah. The guest was actually at the Ed Sullivan Theater when it was being taped. I mean, the guest on my show, and she said the same thing. She said, "Wow, the little hairs on my arm are standing up." But in addition to that, I would say when Tracy Chapman came on towards the end and sang "Stand By Me," I got misty-eyed. It was just beautiful.
Yes.
And then there's that famous Future Islands performance.
Yes.
I have to watch that about once a month.
No, that is amazing. That is amazing. You're right. Those were all great. No, I mean I'm forgetting a bunch, but isn't there also, like, I know Paul Schaefer, when he's asked this question, I think he cites James Brown.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
There's like an incredible James Brown performance. But yeah, there's so many.
We're joined by Jason Zinoman. He's the author of Letterman, The Last Giant of Late Night. What is the most surprising thing that you learned from the process of writing this book?
I think, surprising in terms of what I didn't know going into it was just the extent of which writers contributed critical ideas to what the show was. Or another way to put it would be how collaborative the, late night and the late show were, which I think, if you watch these shows, it just looks like it's a guy talking and expressing himself on TV. So it's like one solitary, it's his thoughts and his ideas. And if you read the press about these shows, you're not disabused of that idea. They're basically written about as if it's, this is the star and this is the creator. He's the creative force of it. He's the auteur, whether it's Letterman or Leno or Conan, whoever else. But the reality is that just like theater or film or whatever, there's a whole lot of people go into making these shows, and many of them, in the case of Letterman, are critical to the parts of his sense of humor that get the most acclaim, and deservedly so. So, that's why the book is not just a biography, but also, tells the story of Merrill Markoe, who, created the show with them and is really as responsible as he is for creating the sort of aesthetic of the 80s Letterman, and Chris Elliott, who, really plays a singular role in the history of the show. And, the early Lampoon writers like, George Meyer and Max and Tom, and, people like Randy Cohen and so many other writers who came up with, the ideas that really made the show what it is. Not to mention people like, Larry Bud Melman, who, you stumble upon that guy. It's like there's not 50 Larry Bud Melmans out there. There's just one. and he's funny in a very specific way. And, one thing that in doing a lot of the reporting for this, two different head writers said to me is they said, I would say, what is Letterman? What are his strengths? And what two of them said was that, he's best in reaction. And so if that's the case, and I think it is, then who he's reacting against is really critical. So I think people like Larry Budd and Chris Elliott and some of these writers are tremendously important to, the history of this guy's work.
And I think that's something interesting about this book is that there's a lot of different voices. You got the chance to interview David Letterman, but there's these other people. You mentioned Merrill Markoe. Who would you say, when you got the chance to speak with them, did you find particularly fascinating?
That's a really good question. Particularly fascinating. There were so many people. I mean, Steve O'Donnell, who, not many people know his name, but he was the head writer. I'm hoping I'm getting these dates right, but I think from 84 to 90, and he started before that. And he really, those were really fertile years, if not the most fertile, most innovative years. And, in a lot of ways, he is like Letterman in that he's a kind of Midwestern guy with sort of blue collar roots. And he had this real innovative, creative streak, this kind of oddball streak, but it's a subtle one. You can kind of miss it. And he's incredibly, and I interviewed him many times, and for many hours, several times and for many hours. And he's just a very cerebral, thoughtful, smart guy. Besides being a funny guy, he was incredibly, I learned a lot just talking to him. He just has a very interesting mind. And, not one of these people who's like a kind of quiet, has a quietly anarchic sensibility. If you just see him, you think, he's just sort of like a guy in khakis, but he's actually has quite an offbeat way of looking at the world. And there's a lot of people like that. I think if I was to make generalize the kind of people who flourished in that show, were people like Hal Gurney, incredibly interesting guy, the director of the show, and also just somebody who was incredibly innovative with what to do with the camera and finding jokes, visual jokes that no talk show director had gotten before. So, and just also is a very sophisticated, interesting guy. George Meyer, a lot of these writers, frankly, I found really, really interesting. And unexpected. Merrill Markoe, of course, who's, a major figure in the book. But so, yeah, they were all really, really fascinating. I mean, if I have a regret, like, there's a few people I would have loved to talk to who I couldn't because they passed away. I mean, like Larry Bud Melman. But originally, one of my goals was to do like a whole chapter on like figuring him out. And he's from Brooklyn and actually went to school not far from where I live, and has the interest, was like a real showbiz fanatic, and who had like a day job while he was appearing on late night, and was sort of he was an interesting guy in a lot of ways, and to the extent that he was, how in on the joke he was is a matter of disagreement on the show, or among people, I should say. So he's one person who I think is really interesting, but I didn't talk to.
This is probably a difficult question, but who would you say had the biggest hand in creating the entity we know as Letterman, other than Letterman?
Well, that would be Meryl Marco. That's not difficult. That's difficult. I mean, that is, and the argument for that is she came up with Stupid Petrix, viewer mail. She did all the remotes, and according to most of the writers, including Letterman himself, that the more sort of adventurous aspects of the comedy early on were advocated by her. And then once he got a reputation for doing kind of adventurous, unusual stuff, then they did more of that stuff. So the fact that she had that voice early on, I think, made her really critical. I mean, essentially, I started the book with a bunch of different questions that I didn't know the answer to, and one of which was, how could this guy who's like this Midwestern conventional fraternity brother who revered Johnny Carson produce this deeply irreverent, unusual, unorthodox show? And, one of the answers to that is Meryl Marco. It's not the only one, but she was a major piece of that puzzle.
How would you describe her? What was she like to communicate with?
I spent a huge amount of time talking to her, and the most useful of that was on the page, which I think is telling, which is to say that she's a writer first. We would email back and forth. I also went to her house in LA and talked to her, but I think she is a word person, as she would say. She loved Robert Benchley, or loves Robert Benchley, people who write comedy and are sensitive to the language of comedy. So is Letterman, for that matter. So she is somebody who is very, analytical. I think she has a wide, silly streak. She likes a kind of a mood of comedy, which is, I think there's some people who are really like a hard punchline, a sharp incongruity. And I think she really likes to set a kind of funny mood. And she's also like somebody who has lived a pretty fascinating and full life. She's a pretty relentlessly interesting person. I mean, she was around in the 70s comedy scene in LA. She was obviously doing late night in the 80s. Then she's written a bunch of books. She's written for all sorts of TV shows. I mean, she's seen a lot of show business and knows, and has been around everyone from Andy Kaufman to Robin Williams, and so she's not cynical, she's not jaded, but she's she talks about this stuff as someone who's been there, not as a fan or an appreciator.
I'm hoping you can tell us about kind of the journey that you took when you proposed this interview with Letterman.
Mm-hmm.
Were you confident? Were you nervous?
I was nervous. That's true. I think it was a long journey. I of course began the project asking for that, and they never said no, but they didn't say yes for a year and a half. So there was always the possibility that I wouldn't get the interview, and the book was premised on the idea that I wouldn't need to get the interview. So I think that was good because it made me really work hard to report around it and talk to as many people as possible. And then after the show ended and months later, when they agreed to do the interview, I think it was originally planned for just an hour. And so I think most of my nerves were that I had, a year and a half, 2 years of reporting and research full of questions, and an hour is like nothing. So once most of my time was spent trying to just get to the essentials. But then once I got into the interview, I realized that he would have talked for as long as I wanted. He was a great interview. And so if anything, if I could do it again, I would have planned for 10 hours. We ended up talking for 4 hours. But, it wasn't nervous. This is my job and I'm used to talking to people so it wasn't like I was nervous about talking to him. Maybe there was a bit of it in that he's been there's been times when he's been a prickly interview, but that was clear that he wasn't going to be like that pretty soon after. I was mostly just nervous of covering all the ground I needed to cover in such a short amount of time. So, for obviously such a key figure in the book. But, the truth is that he didn't dodge a single question. And I think he enjoyed the interview more than I thought he was going to, because by that point he had been away from the spotlight for a while. And also, I had talked to all these people from his childhood, his friends from when he was a little kid, to guys he went to college with. And, it was a little bit like a This Is Your Life episode. So I think it was enjoyable for him on that count. And so he had a good time. And the fact that he was enjoying himself, made it an easier interview.
And where was the interview conducted?
It was weirdly at a restaurant in the 50s in West Side of Manhattan. And we met early before anyone was there. It might have been before the place opened, or maybe just when it opened. But by the time, it went up until lunch, so it was packed. And Letterman is one of these people who are both very famous, but also you don't see very often out in New York. So people, it's like being with the center of a tornado, because everyone's sort of gawking and looking. You just have to my job is just to kind of zone it out and try to not pay attention to the circus, which is what it is when he, walks into a crowded restaurant.
I'm sure you were super focused on the interview and getting the information out of him, but I'm hoping maybe you can share like a passing thought that you maybe had. You're sitting there with Letterman, the last giant of late night. What were your thoughts?
It's a little surreal. It's a little surreal because obviously he's this guy who I've been, watching my whole life and thinking about for this book for years. And so to see him in the flesh is, if I take out of it a little bit, if I look away from it or look at it like from above, it's a little bizarre. But to be honest with you, he wasn't, his affect and stuff wasn't, he was, for example, serious, which, he was charming and funny, but he was, generally thoughtful and serious, which, as someone who interviews comedians for a living, that's sort of standard. There was this one moment when the one time I had been I went to the second week of the Late Show, and when it was on CBS in '93. And when I went there, I was the summer before I went to college, and I went to the usher and I asked for an autograph, and the usher said, "You can get autographs, you get a can of Spam." So and the doors were opening in 10 minutes, so I had to get a can of Spam in Times Square in 10 minutes or miss the show. So I raced around trying to get it, and I finally found it, and I rushed back, and I gave him this can of Spam, and I watched the show. Then afterwards, I found the usher, and the back it said, "I loves my Spam, David Letterman." And so I had been telling the story for decades, and I was always curious about it, and because I was like, oh, does he always get people to get cans of Spam or whatever? And so I told him the story years later, and right when I started telling the story, he sort of stopped me, and he was like, that I didn't sign it. That was somebody else who signed that for me, for sure. I didn't know. And that was sort of an interesting moment, because it was that he was clearly like I was sort of in that moment describing the fans' excitement, and he had to be like, no, actually that was all a lie. And he felt bad about it. You could see he felt bad about it, and he was apologetic about it. And at the same time, it's not like I was like, I'm not that kid anymore. So it wasn't like I was devastated by it, but it was an interesting moment that, what it's like to like live with these expectations of fandom. There's obviously all these good sides to it, but there's also this sort of responsibility of it. And you can kind of see both that and also his habit of taking like a somewhat negative experience and then sort of dramatizing it, which, seemed very characteristic of him.
We're joined by Jason Zinoman, author of Letterman, The Last Giant of Late Night. I got this quote from Don Giller, The Dons.
The Dons. I love the Dons.
And to tell some of the people out there that maybe don't know, he is digitizing, is it every single episode of Letterman and putting it on YouTube?
He's the only person on earth who has every single episode ever recorded that he ever of Letterman, but not all of them are digitized. So he's in the process of doing that, and he was absolutely invaluable, essential to not just my book, but so many people who write about Letterman, because if they want an episode, they have to go to the Dons, and he'll he will in no time, if he likes you, send it to you. So he's become kind of, I wrote about him in the Times, the sort of unofficial archivist for David Letterman.
Well, given that, this should be high praise. He said, I like the way he handled the extensive Letterman interview he conducted for the book. Instead of highlighting it, he merged relevant quotes seamlessly into the narrative, just another voice among equals instead of it being the definitive word. So, with that note, I would be curious, and the Dons would be curious to know, what was the approach that you were trying to take? What were you trying to create with this book?
Well, I think that's very nice to hear from the Dons, and I think that's rooted in my experience as a reporter, which is to say that like one person's take on a situation is just that. That if you really want to get, it's amazing how you could like see like something happening on the street that 5 people see. You talk to those 5 people, and they all describe the same thing, but they have slightly different takes on it or slightly different shades on it. So this operates in a very peculiar way when it comes to like famous people who have told the same stories over and over again who have very specific and calcified narratives about their life. That you can learn a lot about Brian De Palma by talking to Brian De Palma, but you can learn even more, in my experience, by talking to all the people around Brian De Palma and then talking to Brian De Palma, and then you compare those notes. So that was always the idea with Letterman, is that he has his narrative of his life that has been told many, many times. And it's also weird. This is also something about how memory works. We all do. Right, I have my memory about people say, how do you get your job? And I describe it, and I've told the story so many times that when I tell it now, I remember telling the story, not the actual events. So it's even when you think, I'm not saying anyone's lying, I'm saying even the way you build your own narratives, you end up telling things that aren't, they're mild kind of deceptions. And what the reporter can do is can try to get closer to the truth by talking to as many different people around, with many different perspectives, and then compare them and try to look at, judge what each person's motivation through the lens of each person's motivation, etc. So, what Don is saying is true, that what Letterman said about these things is tremendously important and to his story and critical. But I also learned a lot, not just from talking to other people, but talking to other people and asking Letterman, all right, so this is what this person said about this experience. What's your take on that? I mean, in a lot of ways, for instance, Letterman is like, when I talked to him, was incredibly humble and takes no credit for anything. Everything is, right, I came up with this, or I was, he's always very self-deprecating. It's not like, some people, it's like they're always puffing themselves up. Letterman is the opposite situation, is that, it's almost, can I trust that he did so little? And a lot of the times you can't, And I, especially because, as I've told you, I sort of like, part of my argument is that all these other people who were important to the show, there came a period when I had to ask myself, all right, am I biased because Letterman is so quick to not take credit for anything? And so it's a complex thing to figure out the truth of these stories, but it begins with reporting, and reporting means talking to people who are not famous and famous, have little clout, have a lot of clout, who have all different kinds of angles, guests, production, writers, people with big megaphones, with small ones. It's really important, I find, to get a diversity of viewpoints on the same event.
I know you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that you were a Dylan fan, and
yeah,
from the writer of The Times They Are A-Changing, when I read your book the second time, Letterman, The Last Giant of Late Night, it occurred to me how much the book was about change, And it's so cool that Dylan, in one of the last episodes of the show, decides to sing that old song, The Night We Called It a Day. It felt like Dylan was coming in and announcing the end of an era,
Yes, definitely.
I would be curious to know, did writing this book, did it have an effect on your own life, or maybe how you look at change?
Wow, that's another great question. It definitely did. I mean, one, it made me miserable for a couple of years. Writing a book is really hard, and it takes away a lot of your time and attention, but sort of your like intellectual time and physical and actual time. So that's one thing. But this book was like a real big, it was a big accomplishment for me. It was one of the most ambitious reporting projects and critical projects of my life, maybe the biggest. And it's very hard for me to, it's something that was both personally, as I said, like both mattered a lot to me and my own life, but also to the culture. So it was, I saw it as a very personal, even in the sense of like, all right, my sense of humor is really defined by this guy. So to see where that comes from is interesting. And both and that has the negative side too. I mean, there's a lot of themes in the book about like the meanness of the humor, the ironic distance, the kind of ironic distance that is embedded in Letterman's sense of humor that had such an influence on people like me and of my generation. Did that prevent did that prevent people from expressing other kinds of emotions? I think you become more aware of what sort of seeing the world through this, highly ironic, self-deprecating pose does to you. And I think, it can be very helpful in terms of expressing yourself in some ways, but I think in other ways it can be limiting. So better understanding that was definitely, I think, helped, was life-changing. And I think, but I also just think in the sense of like, oh, this was really hard. It was incredibly hard to pull off. I'm really proud of it. And, who knows, maybe once I did it, I was like, all right, this is what I should be doing. You spend a lot of your career doing all kinds of different things and trying different things. And the things that are the hardest are often the most satisfying. And that clearly this was one of them. And so now I'm sort of at a place where I'm like, all right, I'm trying to figure out what's the next version of this. It's very hard to figure it out. It's very hard. I don't see it right now. Like, what's something that I think is as personally worthwhile and as big of a subject that is not only, that is the kind of subject that is I can do a good job with, that I feel I can do a good job with. That also, I think, the other thing that I think is suited for me for this book is that it mixes reporting and criticism, which is, I think at my best, I do both and mix and meld them. So anyways, that's all to say that, it was a very important, life-changing book that makes me look at my work in a very different way.
All the listeners out there, they can follow you on Twitter It's Zinoman, at Zinoman. It looks kind of like Zinoman, but it's Zinoman. And they can follow you. And thank you very much for making the time to talk to me. I would like to just kind of give you the microphone in closing. Just let you take the stage. Whatever you'd like to say to the audience.
Well, no, I think I just want to say this has been, you've asked fantastic questions. The ones I haven't heard before, which I appreciate, and that made me think harder, and I really am grateful for it. And it's just a pleasure to be on the show with someone who's, so smart, asking good questions, and also clearly a fan and appreciator of his work.
Well, that's kind of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
All right. Till next time.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.